Let's talk balks in Major League Baseball. Interesting things happen more frequently in baseball than in any other sport by far. In a September game last year between the Marlins and Mets, Marlins reliever Richard Bleier took the ball for the 8th inning with a 6-3 lead. Pete Alonso steps up to bat with a runner on first. Richard Bleier is a then 35-year-old Major League pitcher who had never recorded a balk throughout the entirety of his 7-year Major League career.
So far.
Bleier then proceeds to balk not once, not twice, but 3 times in that at-bat alone. You can imagine just how frustrating this was for a pitcher who clearly had no intent to deceive the runner, especially the second and third time. The first base runner Jeff McNeil was gifted 1 base for each balk, and the Mets were handed a free run. Probably should have given the RBI to the pitcher there. And that pitcher, Richard Bleier, was of course ejected.
3 balks in the inning committed by Richard Bleier. I have never seen anything like that in my life.
So what did Bleier do wrong? First base umpire John Payne argued that Bleier didn't come to a full stop before starting his delivery, which the MLB rules on illegal pitching actions state is a deeply serious offense. But unfortunately, like most other rules in baseball, their enforcement comes down to the judgment of one man. And in this case, as is the case with many others, it was a judgment call the pitcher wasn't too happy with. Bad things happen to those who balk, so don't balk at the opportunity to compete in fantasy baseball this year using today's sponsor, Underdog Fantasy. If you're looking to turn your hours screaming at your favorite teams on the telly into a fun experience that pays you for your knowledge about the sport, teams, and players you love, then you've got to try Underdog Fantasy, the best and easiest place to play fantasy sports. The concept is simple, the job even simpler. You'll have to pick the simple question of higher or lower. In Underdog's Pick'em game, you pick your favorite baseball players and predict whether they'll go higher or lower on stats like strikeouts, hits, and more. This is actually my first time playing fantasy baseball, and I'm having an absolute blast with it so far. I couldn't think of a smoother transition into the world of fantasy sports than Pick'em. It's a great way to get yourself started. And if you sign up with promo code SRS, Underdog will double your first deposit up to $100, so you'll have some cash to start playing with. That's UnderdogFantasy.com on a browser or Underdog Fantasy in the App Store, and if you sign up with promo code SRS, you'll get your first deposit doubled up to $100. A big thank you to Underdog Fantasy for sponsoring today's video. The whole point of the balk rule is to prevent deception to the runner, and according to Major League Baseball, there are a ton of ways a pitcher can do so. Not coming to a full stop before delivering, trying to pick off a runner improperly, even accidentally dropping the ball after coming set. There are just so many ways for pitchers to fail on the mound. I mean, guys like Patrick Corbin have enough to worry about out there, let alone all these potential violations.
I'm fighting for my life! Y'all killing me with this!
Beginning in 1898, if any umpire on the field believes a pitcher's motion is deceitful to the runner, they can call a balk. And that's of course based on rules that state what is legal on the mound. Once this happens, all runners advance a base and the ball is declared dead. If there are no runners on base, a ball is added to the count, and something you might not have known is that if a pitcher still goes through with the delivery and the ball gets away from the catcher, runners can advance further at their own risk. The rule was made to better balance the baseball player's base path experience. Try saying that 5 times fast. Experience to better balance the baseball players. After relatively lax enforcement during most of the 20th century, a quick rule change and stricter enforcement among umpires in 1988 led to the so-called Year of the Balk, in which Major League Baseball saw record numbers of balks throughout the league. And not a single chicken in sight. Come on, that was funny. That slight rule change I mentioned came just before the 1988 season, and it stemmed from an argument made by Cardinals manager Whitey Herzog in the previous year's World Series, who claimed that Twins pitcher committed over a dozen balks that were uncalled in the '87 World Series, a series that the Twins took in 7 games. Here's more on the Year of the Balk. Before 1988, the single-season record for balks by a pitcher was 11. It was Hall of Famer Steve Carlton's record. He leads pitchers in balks all time with more than double the amount of the runner-up. With the updated rule in place and stricter enforcement, Carlton's single-season record was finally broken in 1988. It took all of 1 month. It was broken in April. Only 13 players in baseball history have committed 10 or more balks in a season, and 11 of them came in 1988. The most fun fact of all from this season, the Oakland A's combined for 76 balks as a team. The second highest combined total that season was 63. Which were committed by literally everyone else. The A's balked 13 more times than every other team in baseball combined this season, and somehow they still managed to win the pennant that year. There were 7 pitchers in 1988 who had at least as many balks as Carlton's previous single-season record. so it makes sense why the league reverted back to the pre-1988 rule. Flash forward to today, there's a whole long list of things a pitcher can't do, at least officially. Some others include no flinching once set, no fake throws to first, no switching from the windup to the stretch without disengaging the rubber, or vice versa, no mimicking a part of a pitching motion without being on the rubber, no throwing to a base on a pickoff without stepping directly toward the base, no starting a pitching motion without completing the pitch, no pitching without facing the batter, and no pitching without the catcher being in the catcher's box. Has that actually happened? And even more illegal motions that the league deems to be too deceptive to a runner. MLB came out again this year claiming they'd be stricter with their enforcement of the rule. The difficult thing about the balk is the variability in its enforcement, even more so, I think, than balls and strikes. And that could be a serious burden to pitchers. I heard a story a few years ago about Cubs reliever Carl Edwards Jr. In 2019, he was working on a new delivery throughout spring training to help improve his command. He started to do some kind of a double toe tap in his windup. Imagine like Kenley Jansen, but someone you'd probably have a much better shot against in a bar fight. Edwards' new move had never been ruled illegal throughout almost the entirety of spring training camp, but it took until the last second when umpire Bill Miller called him out on it late in spring training. Edwards had to quickly revert back to his old motion, which he did by his second appearance that season, but only after MLB had decided on a whim to let him know after weeks of him already adjusting to the change. He was sent down to work on his mechanics in April. He suffered several injuries throughout the season and had the worst year of his career by far up to that point. Not saying the sudden overhaul of his mechanics had anything to do with it, but pitchers are definitely creatures of habit. There have been so many instances, especially of late, where managers and players are left baffled by an umpire's interpretation of the balk rule. Ryan Stanek of the Astros recently balked in the go-ahead run in the 8th inning of a game against the Dodgers, which proved to be the deciding run in an 8-7 Houston loss. Dusty Baker was quoted calling Stanek's reaction to the call ballistic, which, I mean, we probably didn't need Dusty's account for.
It's a connection to a bygone era when men settle their differences face to face, thrusting their chest into one another.
I miss having a guy yelling
and while
my
we're talking
mouth.
about stuff, I've never cleaned my ice tray.
Oh, you have to do
Why
that.
do I have to?
There were 3 controversial balks called in the same week last summer, and if the rule can confuse longtime baseball veterans like Dusty Baker and Alex Cora, safe to say the fans will feel the same way. I saw this pickoff by Trevor Rogers the other day on Twitter, or X now, or whatever that dipshit calling it. And it seemed like people were at each other's throats arguing about it. It's hard to expect fans to have a unified understanding of the rule if the league's enforcement is so unclear and inconsistent itself. I actually used to balk a lot when I pitched. Sometimes I would just flat out not throw the ball to first after I started to motion a pickoff. I lived and breathed baseball up to that point. I still had literally no clue how it worked. Somewhat unrelated, but I wanted to make sure this funny little story gets in this video too. Back in 2014, Mets beat writer Anthony DiComo tweeted in one of the year's final games that the Mets could become the first team in 15 years to go an entire season without balking. Guess what happened literally 120 seconds later? I've gained a newfound respect for Major League pitchers. It takes a lot of mental discipline to be mindful enough to hold completely still with thousands of people screaming at you, let alone having to remember every moment the dozens of other illegal motions you can't make, even if it all comes down to how one umpire is feeling that day. Combine this with the newly added limits to pickoff moves, a pitch clock that's apparently strong enough to break Max Scherzer, larger bases, stricter enforcement of the balk, constant TSA-style pat-downs by umpires, and it looks like the sun may finally be setting ever so slightly on the golden era of pitching.